A new row about transgender rights and free speech has erupted at the University of Sussex. The controversy centres around the gender-critical academic Kathleen Stock, who has been subject to protests by students who deem her views transphobic. Kathleen Stock has denied being a transphobe. She is, however, committed to the belief that trans women with male genitalia should be denied access to women's spaces. In her latest book, Material Girls, she complains that, and I quote, immersion in a fiction about sex change is being coercively required of people. The controversy at Sussex came up this week on Question Time, and TV doctor and scientist Robert Winston gave this response.
I will say this categorically, that you cannot change your sex. Your sex actually is there in every single cell in the body. You have a chromosomal sex, you have genetic sex, you have hormonal sex, you have all sorts of different kinds of psychological, brain sex, they're all different. And we are very confused about this, unfortunately, and regrettably, it's got into this argument that people are will now accuse me of being transphobic.
Well, obviously there are trans people who say you absolutely can do that.
Well, unfortunately, you can't say this publicly. This is one of the big problems. Even saying this on this program undoubtedly will result in my getting a huge amount of hate mail. It always does. But I do think it's a big issue about the attitudes. There are, of course, issues which are important about young people who are confused about their sex, but we won't go down that route here. But it does affect a whole lot of issues in schools and elsewhere in our society. Of course, we should accept people as they are. Overall, I think it's a very sad thing that we can't discuss biological science without actually getting completely caught up emotionally with something which is really completely wrong.
Let's look specifically at the core empirical claim he made there. So he said, I will say this categorically that you cannot change your sex. Your sex actually is there in every single cell in the body. You have a chromosomal sex, you have genetic sex, you have hormonal sex, you have all sorts of psychological brain sex. They're all different. That statement has been celebrated by so-called gender-critical feminists as confirming their contention that trans women can never be women. So what should we make of Robert Winston's comments? I spoke earlier to Shon Faye, author of the best-selling The Transgender Issue.
Well, I mean, it's news to me that I can't change my chromosomal sex. I mean, no one has ever told me that. And anyone who tries to tell me that is always thrown in jail. That's very true. Professor Winston makes such a bold point there. Yeah, I mean, that answer was a kind of bizarre mixture of things. I mean, obviously he's correct, as pretty much every trans person I know would agree about the unchangeable nature of your genetics. And this is kind of where this debate gets lost, I think, is that it often seems to put arguments in the mouths of trans people that I've certainly never heard, and I don't think any of us are making. Interestingly, he does outline the fact that, which would be an argument that I have made and do make, which is that obviously what we mean by sex can mean many different things. So yes, chromosomal sex, which is immutable, but it can also mean, we refer to it to mean hormonal sex, which he mentioned, which was odd because he said you cannot change your sex, then outlined hormonal sex. And I mean, I'm here to say your hormonal sex can change because I've changed it. And of course, a lot of the things in science that are tied to sex are tied to the distribution of hormones in your body. So like if someone was treating me as a male with a testosterone-driven endocrine system, they would be sadly disappointed. So someone would have to consider the fact that I've reconfigured my hormonal balance. And then he even referred to brain sex or psychological sex, which I suppose is what I would call gender identity, because I think brain sex potentially sounds a bit backwards. But even there, he's sort of acknowledging, bizarrely in trying to sort of put words in the mouths of trans people, he seemed to be acknowledging something that is correct and was actually what I agree with, which is that sex as we use it is often means a cluster of things. And the difficulty in this discussion is that people start to isolate different meanings of how they use the term sex, and often to talk at cross purposes about it, which he seemed to kind of actually demonstrate in his answer. The other thing I would probably say, is that this idea that it's sort of unsayable in mainstream discourse, I find quite amusing as a trans person, because I think people are very quick to say it. But fundamentally, I guess my fundamental reaction to his comments there are, why are we discussing genetic sex with regards to trans people, because all of what my work has certainly been about is about talking about the social experience of trans people, which is what we call gender, and how people are politically and socially treated as a regards of their gender identity and gender expression and the consequences that can have for them. And it's sort of bizarre that we've gotten very much trapped into this discussion of biology, which is obviously relevant in certain circumstances, particularly reproductive biology, but certainly your chromosomes. I mean, no one's seeing your chromosomes when they're harassing you.
We've talked about these issues sort of before in the DMs, and I suppose I come from a perspective where I feel like actually maybe trans people, or not, I'm not putting the burden on trans people, but people arguing for trans rights maybe should talk about biology a bit more, because what's going on at the moment is Robert Winston saying, look, I'm the guy who's talking about science, about how things really are. And then activists from Stonewall or whatever are buying into this line where you've got sex is one thing, gender is another, and it makes him seem like he's the realistic guy. Whereas what I thought when I saw that clip was he's saying, oh, there is brain sex, right? So it's this idea that trans women have a male brain and they're just pretending to be women. Whereas one potential comeback to that is that there are lots of studies that suggest that actually the structure of trans women's brains are very similar to the structure of cis women's brains. So there is a sort of biological underpinning to transness, which is an argument I see as often people are unwilling to make, which I think would probably counter Robert Winston quite successfully, but is avoided.
What I make of it, the reason that it's avoided is because certainly not all. I don't, for example, believe there's a biological underpinning to transness, and I don't think there needs to be. And I think like advancing it as a universal. I mean, there are some people that very fundamentally do believe that, particularly people who felt acute sense of their gender identity or gender dysphoria from a very, very young age, and they can remember it, or children. But fundamentally, to me, it's the same argument as looking for a gay gene, right? It's actually a very dismal way to look at human sexuality, to understand it not as a social phenomenon, but to have to be like, not our fault, we're born this way. And it's the similar thing. I think where it comes to biology, sure, if you want to talk about medical treatment, it is relevant, right? Like, I don't have a uterus, I'm never going to give birth to children. A trans man might need a cervical smear, as we kind of heard endlessly around the Labour Party conference, is that obviously that this contention over cervixes, when we know that there are trans men with cervixes, obviously there it's relevant to talk about it for the purposes of healthcare. But a lot of the reason, I don't think when you say Stonewall is sort of like not talking about biology, I mean, it's not really relevant to what Stonewall's work is. Stonewall's work, for example, is usually going to workplaces, sometimes schools, and being like, here's how to make this environment more welcoming to trans people. And then you're talking about what? Like making sure that you respect people's pronouns in the workplace, or making sure there's a gender neutral toilet. Really, biology doesn't come into that. And often I think what happens with the kind of canard that trans people are like fundamentally biology deniers, despite the fact that we like are constantly banging on about the fact that you have to wait ages for healthcare that we need. Often if you're transsexual, as in older discourse, if you're someone that wants to medically transition, you're fully aware of your sex characteristics and your need to change them. So like we're actually acutely aware of biology. I think where it becomes a sensitive topic is that then the term sex is levied as a kind of biological truth in order to make exclusionary arguments about denying trans people services, inclusion, solidarity. And particularly in the case of trans women, it's often kind of levied to suggest that, there are some experiences we will never have regards to reproductive biology. But also it sort of quite quickly morphs into arguments about why we should be denied services based on gender-based violence, which we do experience, normally to make quite grim arguments about the fact that people find our bodies a bit gross, or they think we're a bit masculine, or they think we're a bit aggressive. I mean, that's what it quite quickly morphs into, is when people talk about male and female, they want to make trans women seem like mannish aggressors. So quite quickly, a discussion of biology slips into a discussion of behavior, and that's the slippage you get between gender and sex in this.
Kathleen Stock, who was brought up sort of as the basis of that question there on Question Time. She is someone who is considered a transphobe by lots of people. She would call herself gender critical. As far as I understand it, her core beliefs are that trans women shouldn't be able to use women's spaces because she wants to protect sex-based rights. My question for you is less about her particular views, but about the strategy of sort of protesting her writing those things and whether or not she should lose her job.
As I understand it, the people who have been protesting her are students on campus at Sussex University where she teaches. She sort of mentioned that some of it is intimidating. And actually, I have had, I mean, if I'm being sympathetic, I've had, when I go to talk at events, people on the gender critical side put up posters in the women's toilets about me. And it is a little bit menacing. I won't lie, as someone that's experienced it, it's not pleasant to experience. And it personally isn't my preferred way. However, I think it's what's kind of been lost a little bit in this is that obviously the power dynamic is that she is a professor at the university, and the students who are protesting her are often LGBTQ plus and students and sometimes feminist students too, who are 18, 19 undergraduates who I guess there is a power dynamic there where she is in a position, she has an OBE, she's a professor at a university, she has a huge platform in the media. She has significantly more power than the students that are protesting her in real world terms, something that she isn't very willing or conscious to admit. And so I think it's worth reintroducing that power dynamic. And I think what sometimes happens is when you have a group with less power, so we're talking here about sort of students, not all of whom are actually trans themselves, but certainly, supportive of trans rights. And then a professor with a degree of institutional power in this context is sometimes, I think, the terms of engagement will be perhaps not ideal because they don't have access to the same forms of protest. There might be calls for her to get sacked. That might be something lots of people disagree with. Personally, I'm not really one for, I think there is a distinction between protest and harassment. I think people should be able to protest. I think it's a healthy student culture. It's actually healthy for free speech, that people should be able to legitimately protest. If they're holding up signs saying that they don't like what she's teaching or they don't like what's in her book, and there is understandable reasons why people might not like it. She just, in her book Material Girl, she says that all trans people are basically living in an immersive fiction, which I would say is like a very middle class, polite way of saying that we're delusional. And I can understand why that would be deeply angering and hurtful to many. And I think that's fine to protest that. I think that's very different to if there are people who are threatening her with violence or threatening her, making conditions in which she doesn't feel safe to practice her job physically, then sure, that I think that's beyond the limits of acceptability. What's very hard to gather from the social media kind of discussion of all this is exactly what the nature of the protests were. Because I saw one thing that said she was a victim of a poster campaign. And as someone that's had quite mean posters made about them, it isn't pleasant, but like also it is a form of protest. And it isn't actually necessarily always an inhibition to free speech. You don't really, people have a right of reply. And the trouble is that the students who are making a right of reply don't have the same discursive tools at hand that she does because they're not in the same position of power.